All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending today's presentation. Before we begin, I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land from which Daniela is joining us is the traditional unceded territory of the uOttawa and Mi'kmaq peoples. This territory is covered by the treaties of peace and friendship, which uOttawa and Mi'kmaq peoples first signed with the British Crown in 1725. The treaties did not deal with surrender of lands and resources, but in fact recognized Mi'kmaq and uOttawa titles and established the rules for what was to be an ongoing relationship between nations. Interesting. My name is I'm joining from Montreal, which is situated on the traditional territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka, a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst many First Nations. My name is Michaela, and I'm a McGill grad, currently completing my Pathy Fellowship in Montreal. I have the honor of introducing Daniela Gallardo for her final fellowship presentation today. And I've had the privilege of getting to know Daniela over the course of our fellowship year. Today's presentation will consist of a 25-minute presentation followed by a 25-minute Q&A period, which I will moderate. Please note that this presentation is being recorded and live streamed on Facebook. Daniela is a University of Ottawa grad with a bachelor's in linguistics and life sciences. Her university studies allowed her to get involved with Best Buddies, psycholinguistics research, as well as her on-campus work as a technology student mentor. Her community that she worked with this year was the Newcomer community in her hometown of Moncton, New Brunswick, alongside her community partner MAGMA, the Multicultural Association of the Greater Moncton Area. Daniela is passionate about social inclusion, community equity, and connecting her personal interests into tangible work. It was through her involvement with MAGMA over several years as a language class assistant and tutor that drove her to connect the skill sets she learned as a technology mentor into her role as a fellow. Her fellowship initiative has consisted of creating a technology literacy program for MAGMA newcomers receiving English classes as an adjunct to their language training. Over the course of the community phase, Daniela was able to work with a class of adult newcomers to provide weekly skill set-based workshops and allow for the inclusion and expansion of traditional language learning to blend into digital avenues and spaces. This also allowed newcomers to enhance their English learning and grow their confidence into accessing computer and technology spaces to enhance their daily lives. I first met Daniela one-on-one in a Zoom breakout last June, and even through a screen, her charisma was infectious. I don't think I'd had a belly laugh over video conferencing software until I met her. I've had the pleasure of getting to bounce ideas off of Daniela over the course of community phase, and can testify that aside from the joy she brings to conversation, she's also passionate and considerate. The way that she informs her work and worldview through her experience and charitable observations of others is admirable, which I'm sure you'll find in her presentation today. Just a quick reminder that throughout Daniela's presentation, we encourage you to make comments and ask questions in the chat box or comment section of either Zoom or the Facebook live stream. We'll be watching these feeds and collating comments and questions, and we'll moderate a Q&A period following the presentation. If you are joining us on Zoom, please consider turning off your microphone and cameras to limit background noise and help with connectivity. Should you have any technology concerns, please feel free to let us know via the chat box. And without further ado, I would like to pass the virtual microphone over to today's presenter, Daniela.
Thank you for that, Michaela. That actually makes me want to laugh right now. So very fitting that you wrote that for me. Thank you, everybody, for taking the time out of your day to join us. I know that for some of you, this is the third presentation today. And for others, I'm catching you at the end of your workday. So I really appreciate you taking the time to hear a little bit more about the work that I've been up to for the past year. Like Michaela said, my project took place in my hometown in Moncton, New Brunswick on the East Coast. And the initiative in this project was named the Learning and Technology Mentoring Program. And it serviced exactly what it says, the Moncton newcomer population. So trying to capture what exactly I've been up to for the past 12 months is really challenging. It's incredibly hard. But I feel like the best way to try and conceptualize the work and the path that this has taken over the past 12 months could be best described and visualized through three main components. If this will change slides for me. It is not changing slides for me. Oh wait, here we go. Into three main areas. The first one being my community. So the groups, the peoples, and the experiences that helped shape and define what the community was, and led to the conceptualization of what the program was, of the Learning and Technology Mentoring Program that leads into the second phase of this year. And the third one being just this overall experience being in the Pathy Fellowship, because it's a quite unique and rare experience unless if you're in it. So I hope to do my best to try and bring you through like a timeline of this past year. And I hope you enjoy. So to come and talk about the heart and the inspiration of this initiative, I have to take you back about 39 years. So 39 years ago, my mom and dad came to Canada as refugees from El Salvador. And they faced the exact same barriers and very similar barriers to what a newcomer would have faced today. So they were presented with a language barrier, with a culture shock, with having to access resources with very little to no familiar support. But as we all know, humans are so resilient. And my mom actually learned English from English classes that her local resettlement agency were giving out. She eventually found a part-time job. And even further down the road, she graduated from the University of Toronto with a degree in computer science. And as I'm talking to you today, I see kind of like the irony behind that, and that she has a degree and a family connection to computer science, but I was not facilitating coding or computer science skills at all. That is not a skill that I learned during the pandemic, but it would have been nice. And so really this project was a way to connect like my home and as an homage to my family, but also as an appreciation to like the land itself. So, you know, my parents' original connection to this land has been through a journey of displacement. But, you know, once we came in, me and my brother came into the picture, this is the land where we call home, and this is where we're connected to. And so it was a bridge for this initiative to bring like my family's story, but also like the story that we're making now in my hometown. And when I was thinking of the concept behind this initiative, there were two probably key experiences that led me to coming up with this idea. And the first one was in my work as a technology student mentor at the University of Ottawa. And this was where I was giving one-on-one mentorship sessions to university students with disabilities. And I was helping them access like software, assistive programs on computers to help them facilitate their university studies and help them bridge their learning. And this was really like the first kind of like frontline experience where I saw like just how much support this community needed in order to like translate what they were learning in an academic setting into a way that like they could access and make sense to them. And this kind of really sparked like an interest in like making me just wanting to be more aware of like how this was also present in my hometown. And as Michaela said, I was connected and have been connected with MAGMA since 2019. They have been serving the community for over 20 years. They have the largest social media following out of any of the newcomer resettlement agencies in the whole Atlantic region. And they just have a breadth of programs like to service this whole entire journey for newcomers, ranging from, you know, finding housing, employment initiatives, the language training, of course, and finding those community connections around them. And so when I was a volunteer in one of these language classes at MAGMA, I saw this exact same experience shown in this community where newcomers are learning language, they're developing their literacy, and some teachers would bring these newcomers into the computer lab, which was such a unique and like such a blessing that they have this room already set up with a bunch of monitors, a bunch of technology. But I noticed that like for this instance, the technology itself and the computers themselves were actually a barrier to learning the language. These newcomers would come in, and the intention behind the activity was for them to learn through a game. But some of these newcomers had never touched a computer before. And so when I approached MAGMA for this initiative, my amazing community contacts, Angela and Kim, we found that we could use what was already in the community and start this program, start a workshop where for one and a half to 2 hours every week, they could focus solely on like this digital literacy aspect. And it could coincide at the same time with what they were learning. So, if the theme of the month was like health and safety, we could tailor those activities on the computers to reflect that learning in like a practical way. And the second key experience that influenced the planning in like a very unintentional and like not anticipated way was the year of the pandemic. So for those of you who don't know, I was actually part of the original cohort that was selected back in 2020. And then when the pandemic happened, this year was postponed. So I actually worked for a whole year in my community, but as a disability support person, I was working with adults who had an intellectual disability, find resources around them. And this was where like I became introduced to these concepts in the disability field that really coincide with the teachings of the Coady Institute and the way that this whole initiative was structured actually. So concepts like person-centered planning, asset-based approaches, and support network building were things that I was using in my work during my year off that actually influenced the entire delivery of the initiative. So in the first month, Angela and Kim introduced me to Anastasia, and she was an ESL teacher who had a class of adult newcomers at a CLB level 4 English level. And this is kind of important because this level is actually the second last level that newcomers need to pass before they can apply for citizenship. And this is also a level 2 where newcomers have like a basic and a good grasp on literacy, and where they can actually start to take steps and show interest in finding employment very soon. And so when I was introduced to this class, I came to them with nothing planned. I came to them with a curriculum that wasn't developed. The only elements that really were concrete at the time were the themes of the month that they were going to be receiving anyway for their English training. And so I approached them with this idea. And luckily for me, they were a bit nervous at first and a little bit apprehensive because, when you come in and say, we're going to learn about digital literacy, that can mean so many things. But above all, they realized the need and the excitement, and like they saw at least the potential of what it could mean for them, which is again like something that's highly personal. And so over the course of the community phase, starting in October, we met with a small group of Anastasia students. They ended up being about 6 to 8, like more or less, but a consistent group of 6 to 8. From October all the way to the end of May, we met 23 times, so that's 23 workshops. Each workshop ranged from like 1.5 hours, sometimes to 3, depending on the activity, depending on the time of the year. And we did many activities. They ranged from knowing where to find a walk-in clinic, knowing how to find a family doctor, knowing how to like find and replace stolen documentation, and like what you need to show to like do that successfully. One activity we did was on how to get a driver's license in the province. We did activities on e-commerce and online shopping. We actually even had an introduction to Amazon one day. We also had workshops how to book travel, so how to book plane tickets, where you can go, what options you have to do that. We did other workshops talking about like financial literacy, a little bit of that. So how to browse the bank institutions that are around you, the different kinds of accounts, what that means. And above all, like the literacy that comes with learning technology. There's a whole like world of vocabulary that is unique sometimes to using computers, to using cell phones and English. And there's this whole other like world of etiquette that you wouldn't know unless if you have those conversations and have that space to talk about. The other really neat thing that happened in March of the community phase was we were able to purchase laptops for the participants. So this meant that like going forward, every workshop that came after that, the newcomers had their own individual laptops to do this on. And the other neat thing about this moment is that they could take these laptops home with them. And that was so like transformative to the whole learning aspect of the initiative, because when you take it home, like the learning doesn't stop within that 1 hour to 1.5 to 3 hour time frame. And they could choose to use a laptop for what they wanted. And of course, the second or the third, a super neat thing that ended up happening this morning, actually, so very fitting that I get to share that with you today. We had like a celebration and a potluck for the first cohort of newcomers that completed this program and participated. So we gave out participation certificates to the newcomers that had been meeting together since the start of the fellowship, and we were able to celebrate that with them today. And so it's been a really full and fulfilling year. And, you know, throughout the whole course of this, I at least got to see like a really like valuable look at the progress that all the newcomers made from October all the way to May. Originally, what I thought I was going to do was have like 2 groups of the program. So run one group from September until December, and then in the new year, start a new group from January to May. But what ended up happening because of like scheduling and COVID restrictions, it was actually the same group that stayed together for the whole course of the fellowship, which I think was a huge asset at the end of the day, because it was such an extended period of time where you could really start to see like the progress that that everybody was making. And so when it comes to talking about like what came out of this, I've given you the details, the hard facts, and all of that. I knew going into the fellowship, I incorporated, you know, an asset of disability work that's really common, and it's this path like visualization tool. It's typically used to for individuals who have disabilities to map out their dreams and their goals, and it uses a backwards thinking approach to making steps by their support network on how they can get to that goal. And my Northern Star, or the ultimate dream, is to keep creating these confident, empowered, and inclusive communities. And even if you look into that a little bit more, really like what this initiative is aiming for is to create these forms of social mobility and these forms of capital. So, you know, aside from the hard skills of it all, of knowing what a screen is called in English, or knowing what a keyboard is and knowing the right grammar to go along with it, you know, social mobility takes place when a newcomer can learn how to find a family doctor near them, learn how to find maybe patient advocates to come with them to these appointments. It comes when, you know, a newcomer can know the steps to finding a driver's license and then getting that driver's license down the road. That's a form of social mobility, and that it turns into capital, because if that car is the reason they can find a job, that they can provide for their families, that's a form of capital. And it's the whole goal is to create access to these forms of capital to populations who are at a disadvantage, or who maybe don't have the same access to it as other groups in the community. And the other way that really impact took place is through stories. It's through those relationships that were formed, and how these stories are so personal that they reflect the relevance and like the resonance that these people took from the workshops to enhance their own lives. And so here are some of the pictures of the community and the newcomers that that I've been meeting with for the past 8 months, and they've all given me permission to share these pictures with you today. And just some highlights that I wanted to share with you. There were a couple of newcomers that in this program that had never touched a computer before. And one individual in particular, he had never touched a computer, much less in English. And when I saw him this morning, he was telling me that he was now accessing his online bank accounts by himself. A father of 8, again, didn't have access to a computer, didn't know anything. Now he was helping his 8 children, or one of the 8 children at home, with their online schooling. There was another newcomer. She was a mother of 2. She had a daughter in London and has a daughter in Lebanon. And after one of the workshops going over like email basics and all of that, I found out sometime later that her daughter in Lebanon had actually sent her an entire album of photos from her wedding, and she didn't know she had them. She didn't know that they were sitting in her email this whole time. And it's like, now she has those photos of her. Like, now she has her daughter with her when they can't really be in person. And there's other stories like that too. There was another newcomer. She was a single mother of 2. And again, through the workshops, getting comfortable reading in another language, especially when it's on like a virtual platform, we were actually able to help her find and drop off documents to the legal aid clinic. And this morning I found out she has an appointment. So it just really visualizes like how you can take, like, everybody was able to take something out of the workshops, which is so nice. And even aside, like, it goes deeper than like the hard skills, as I was mentioning, because again, there's a vocabulary to this like digital space. So even if perhaps you already knew like how an inbox works, or like how sending an attachment works, you're learning about like the vocabulary, you're learning about the grammar behind it, you're learning about how this works in like Western society. So and this was something that we only really started to scratch the surface with. Now that I think about it, like, there were some times where we had these conversations about like what credit is, and what that means. And so there's this whole like other like field that goes even beyond the technology of it all, that is like made possible because of like this literacy. And here are some pictures from earlier today, actually. So we had a potluck to celebrate, and these are some of the newcomers. Not all of them were able to make it today, but this is the group more or less that I've been with for the past 8 months. So it was really special to like give them like a validation and like accreditation for the hours they've put in. And it's like, these are things that they can use on their resumes. This is something that they put and dedicated energy and time and effort towards. So it's not all, so they get something out of it, something to show it. And of course, along the way, I learned many things. I think perhaps the main challenge going into it, and which I was anticipating, was the facilitation of it all. I'd been a camp counselor before. I knew how like groups worked, right? But never this exact same kind of group. So this was an adult group. I was younger than them, and there was this. I guess I didn't anticipate the extent that this would like show up, but facilitating a group of like 6 to 8 people is really, really hard. The first like month in community, I felt like I was running around and like trying to catch my breath half the time. It took me a while to get used to people's pace, like their learning levels, like what they already knew, especially the language. I had to really change the way that I would explain things, and like also slow down like what I said, because there was a language barrier. Also, there was a challenge to programming at times. There was a 2.5 month period where this entire initiative had to be done virtually because of pandemic restrictions. And that came with its own, with its own set of good and bad things. On one hand, facilitation kind of became easier because, it was a screen share and not me running around trying to make sure that everybody's computer was working right. But on the other hand, it kind of made like individual work, individual handouts to be not really feasible, especially because a lot of these individuals were joining and tuning in from their phones. So already they're like straining their eyes to see me on a small little screen. It wasn't really realistic for me to expect them to complete things independently. But on the other hand, like it kind of forced them to get comfortable with like virtual platforms because they didn't really have a choice. And some of the other things I discovered too, and I kind of touched on this already like a little bit, but for the workshops, like I would try and make handouts of activities and of things that I wanted them to be able to find. And something really, really neat that started almost immediately that I didn't see coming was that the workshop handouts themselves actually became like group reading exercises. So there was this whole like component of just general like English literacy that was able to take place. Like, and I realized they really enjoyed doing it. Like people wanted to participate. People wanted to be reading. They wanted to be pronouncing these words and they wanted to know what they meant. So that was really exciting and something that I didn't anticipate for. And the other thing that I didn't really anticipate for, but I guess I should have, was like this whole like cultural lens that I didn't see taking place. And it took me a while to like conceptualize that. And it can best be described by this. So I learned that silence does not mean that there's a lack of something happening. There were some days where I would facilitate workshops and I would leave thinking like, I think I just spoke to myself the whole time. And especially like it contradicted like the whole purpose of like participatory planning, because on one hand, you want the learning objectives, you want the workshops to be reflections of what the newcomers in the community want to learn. But especially if they're not giving you feedback, it just kind of makes it hard to gauge and hard to read. And then I started to realize, well, maybe there's maybe this clashes with the cultural norms that these people are coming from, especially when you're in like a position of authority or in a position of leadership. It's a sign of respect to stay quiet. And so I learned from this that the best thing I could have done, and the best thing that I hope I did to my best ability, was to show up. Like literally just to show up every week, as I said, make my presence known. And I think this really was what made the relationship start to form and start to break down or like kind of mitigate these things, these behaviors that I was noticing. So towards the end, I think the newcomers were getting more comfortable in finding ownership in their voice and realizing that they had this platform to direct their own learning, which perhaps for some people was the first time that they were in an environment like this. Going forward, I actually, because of the presence that I was able to like maintain and establish, word did start to spread. Which was super encouraging to hear. I know sometimes some of the family members would be asking like, hey, where is this class that I can go where I get a computer? And I know that some teachers were expressing interest in, having something like this for their students. And so I'm really happy to say that in the summer, I'll actually be running a second version of the project or of the program with a new teacher and with a new set of newcomers. So that's been really, really exciting. And the other component that I wanted to make sure and like develop throughout this whole phase and like even beyond was like a facilitation manual or like a guide. And it's basically just a big compilation of all the workshop handouts that were prepared throughout the year. And it's also a compilation of like the themes that are, already standard to what newcomers are learning for their English level training, and like suggested activities that can be done for each of these larger themes. And I think this will be super helpful because down the road, if even if there's like no designated facilitator for this, at least there is like a guide for teachers that are already at MAGMA who perhaps want to incorporate more like digital literacy activities, but don't really know how or don't have time. And this will be at their disposal. So that's been really exciting. And the last like main key component has been the experience as a fellow. It's quite rare to get an opportunity to spend a whole year being 100% autonomous and in control of what you're doing. And so that took some getting used to for a bit, but I realized like the importance of finding your leadership through the relationships that you establish, both within your community and outside of it. I know for a fact that if it hadn't been for Angela and Kim and Anastasia and the relationship we were able to create, the support that came from it is what made this year what it has been. And I also learned like how powerful it is to ask for what you want, and to get comfortable with that, because if you ask for the things that you need, the leadership that you've made through those relationships is what will bring that support to you. And next steps. So as I mentioned before, I will still be continuing on at MAGMA over the summer. And, I still volunteer for them on other projects as well for other programs. So I'm planning on maintaining that connection for many, many years to come. But in the fall, I'll no longer be the main facilitator. I'll be starting my master's in global health at McMaster University. So I also really credit this year for giving us the flexibility and like the freedom to figure out how we want to like combine our passion projects with the careers and like with the life that you want to create for yourself. And, especially with this field of like healthcare, this initiative tapped into just a small little facet of this much larger picture. Like when we had these workshops on finding walk-in clinics, on finding family doctors, on replacing Medicare cards, like that is such one small little determinant of health that is like shaped by the context of our communities. And so I'm super excited to be able to study that in like a much broader way. And I can't finish this presentation without giving a huge thank you to the Pathy Foundation. I mean, and the Coady Institute. Without this funding, without this program, like this entire year wouldn't have been possible. And a huge thank you to Adam, Jess, and Sarah for your support, and for the encouragement and for the belief in our cohort that we can do what we're meant to do. I thank you to the cohort. I know we say amongst ourselves all the time that the friendship we've made was something we never knew we needed. Thank you to Anastasia, Angela, and Kim from MAGMA. I mean, if you hadn't welcomed me into the community the way you did, all of this wouldn't have happened. So incredibly thankful. And of course, thank you to the newcomers for taking a chance and for trusting this new grad to come in and ask to share their mornings with them every week. They took a leap of faith. And so I'm so thankful that they did, and that we were able to have and share the moments that we did. And before I pass it back over to all of you, I'd like to leave with a little story. And it's very fitting that it actually happened 2 days ago. And I think it just kind of like captures this whole process. My mom was actually at the airport 2 days ago, and she saw a Hispanic looking woman at the airport trying to find her bag. And so she came up to this lady, and she asked her if she understood what the man was saying. She said no. And she said, "Do you speak Spanish?" And she said yes. She said she had just come from El Salvador as a refugee, and there were people coming to pick her up. And as my mom is walking out the door out of the airport, she notices that there's a MAGMA van waiting to pick her up. And so like that just kind of shows how like everything is coming full circle. Like this process is ongoing and ongoing and ongoing. And I'm so privileged to have played even like a small little portion or a blip of that journey for the newcomer community in my hometown. And I think that's it from me. I think I've been talking for too long, but thank you. I'll pass it over back if anyone has any questions.
Thank you, Daniela, for that amazing presentation. It's so nice to catch a glimpse of what you've been up to this year, and that story at the end, really heartwarming. So I invite everyone to send in your questions. I also invite you, if possible, turn on your camera and we could have some faces instead of black boxes. But yeah, while I wait for questions to roll in, I actually had a question for you, Daniela. I was wondering if you could speak to the experience of facilitating like intergenerational learning spaces. I'm assuming that most of your students are actually older than you, and I was just wondering if like you learned anything about kind of community building or leadership in that dynamic.
Yeah, I think, yeah, so I was a bit younger. There was definitely an age gap with the group that I was facilitating. I have to say, for the most part, I kind of came in a little bit apprehensive of that too, just because I always would think, I wonder what these people must think. They have lived entire lives up to this point, and now there's this 20-year-old coming in, teaching them things that they're overwhelmed to begin learning about in the first place. But I actually think that was a problem that wasn't a problem. It didn't turn out being a problem in the end. I don't really know what I can credit that for, but maybe just the general atmosphere of the community, because people were so excited and they were so appreciative that it didn't really matter that I was maybe not from their generation, because they could connect it back to their children. So, most of these individuals had families, they have young children, some of them had older children. So I think maybe perhaps they could realize that if it wasn't necessarily me, it could also come through their children in some way. So maybe that helped a little bit, but yeah.
Right, totally. I mean, it sounds like that learning space is probably super rewarding. Subverting those usual roles of teacher, student, like older, younger, everyone's learning from each other.
Yeah, that was super nice too. And eventually we got to a point where sometimes we wouldn't be going that hard on the activity. We would be drinking coffee and we would be talking and just talking about each other. And even when we would have these workshops on for example, that I think that one I mentioned about bank accounts, this is where someone chimed in and was credit cards, and I could relate it back to myself. This is what I have, and this is what it means, this is what I do. And I don't know, yeah, sometimes it just went beyond the content sometime, which was super neat.
Right. I mean, that actually kind of leads into my next question, and I don't know, it's kind of like a looser vague question, but because you brought up those stories, and my favorite one is the woman who finally got to see her daughter's wedding pictures. And I'm just wondering how storytelling played into your pedagogy, or how you kind of adapted to that environment, or if you could just tell us more stories.
Well, so I was super nervous to come up with this whole monitoring and evaluation process, because in some ways this project is kind of traditional in the sense that you're giving these skill-based workshops. So you could present these handouts, and people should be expected to know the terminology behind the computer, behind the hardware. But I guess I don't know. I guess after my first month, I just kind of knew that wasn't ever gonna be a way for me to legitimize it. And stories ended up being literally what made literally what influenced my entire way of measuring the differences that came out of the community. And above all, I have to say, generally people were really they were really happy. They were confident that they were learning these skills, and they overall felt more confident in opening up a browser, whereas from day one this was something that they didn't even know what it meant. So I do have another story. So that same lady, she's originally from Ukraine, and the activity where we were like building like how to like learning how to book a plane ticket, like part of that activity was they could just like choose a trip, like book a trip, you know, not actually book it, but like just to practice like navigating it all. And this same individual, she actually was wanting to do a trip like later this year to go see her mom, and then go see her family back home in Lebanon. So she like actually planned out the exact days that she wanted to go in theory, and she was able to do that. You know, of course, like this was before everything went down like internationally, but it's like at least she can leave with the knowledge that she knows how to do this and knows how to like do that for herself when the time is right and when she can.
That's awesome. I mean, yeah, it almost reminds me of like I think Emily's presentation earlier this week when she's talking about how like in these environments, sometimes it's hard to measure success until I feel like storytelling is almost a good measure because like the level of trust our people have with one another and like the environment it builds. But then I guess success can also be measured in buying a plane ticket to Ukraine once, you know, everything is settled over there. So my next question, also I encourage everyone send your questions in the chat. But I have one more question, and this is more on like the technical side, is that I'm assuming people are coming in with different skill sets and like levels already. And I was just curious, like, how'd you know like where to start and like what content to start with? Did you do like an assessment, or did you just kind of like gauge based on talking, I don't know, to them?
Yeah, so I mean, did we really know what group was best to start with? No. We kind of started to base it off the fact that we didn't want it to be like a repeat kind of what I had seen earlier, where, you know, you're at a very, very basic, you know, literacy level, you're just learning the language. Perhaps shoving a computer in your face isn't, it's just gonna be a little overwhelming. So I think the group we picked in the end was really successful, and it was a good group, because they could already hold, you know, a conversation, and they also like were a class before I came in, so they kind of knew each other. Like there's more like cohesion in the group itself, and then like where to like start doing, you know, skill set based work. When we first met, we had a conversation and said, you know, what do you already know how to do? Like, what have you done before? And so I was able to get, you know, some like loose responses from people. But then when you actually like start to run a first workshop, then you really kind of get to know like, okay, what do you already know how to do? And I think what helped like kind of mitigate this, because everybody was at different levels, and I know that like I was facilitating a group of 6 to 8 people. I know that I couldn't really meet every single person with the same level of attention and detail, because that's just how like facilitation works. But I think even despite that, everybody was able to leave with something new, because there is this whole like other like language component that I didn't anticipate for, but was super glad that was there. So even if like I had some newcomers who literally worked online, right? So, but in their native country. So, so they didn't necessarily need to relearn how to do everything like physically, but the language, that it's not in their native language anymore. So there's reading that needs to happen. There is like translation that you know, you're not wanting to translate, you're wanting to like absorb this information in this new way. So I think either way, this kind of helped everybody like leave with something.
Oh yeah, that's so fascinating. I forgot that the language component's part of it, like translating, you know, computers and like digital literacy to a whole other language. Cool. So we have a question from the chat from Emily. Such amazing work. This is a really hard question and kind of related to issues of assessing success, but how do you define digital literacy?
Yeah, okay. This is a good question. At first, perhaps I thought it was more like a set of hard skills, like knowing how to type out a resume, knowing like how to like search for things. But I also think there's this like other component of like autonomy that's at play, because like pretty much everything we need to access, like literally from finding an apartment to pay your rent to like, even going to school, like you need to know how to look for things, how to find things, and how to do that with like all the platforms that are out there. And so I think like being literate in this, and like in almost like, even if it almost kind of goes like outside of like technology in a way, because it's like you're learning how to like to know what you want in a way, so that you can use the technology or the computers as like a bridge and as like a medium to do that.
Huh.
Good question, Emily. This is hard. I'm like still thinking about it even as I answered it.
Okay, are there any other questions? I'll give everyone a few moments if there's any questions, comments. Otherwise, we'll wrap things up. All right. Well, congratulations, Daniela, on an amazing year. It's so nice to see these pictures and hear these stories after, hearing about them through Facebook Messenger and Zoom calls. And congratulations on your coming steps in another cohort and your studies at McMaster. I look forward to meeting up with you in the 6th.
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for tuning in today.
And everyone who's tuning in either here or on the live stream, I encourage you to check out our schedule. I believe we have 2 presentations left tomorrow, and then it's a wrap. Yeah. Have a great Thursday, everyone.